Right, we have some breaking news just into CNN. A federal judge has ordered former Trump Chief of Staff Mark Meadows and a number of other former top aides to testify in the special counsel's January 6th investigation. The judge rejected Trump's claims of executive privilege. Let's get right to CNN's Evan Perez. Evan, tell us what this means, because this may open the door to so much more information in this case.
It really does, Brianna. The Justice Department has been winning these cases where they're asking a judge to compel some of these former Trump aides to answer questions as part of this investigation into the attempts by the former president to overturn the 2020 election results. And they keep winning these because the judges are finding that because of the importance of this investigation.
All right. So imagine this: you're in court, you're under oath, and you tell your version of events. You make certain claims, you present certain facts, and then the judge, who's been carefully reviewing everything, looks up and says, "Wait a minute, this doesn't add up." Who's been carefully reviewing everything looks up and says, "Wait a minute, this doesn't add up. Your testimony contradicts the evidence. The documents don't match what you said. The emails tell a different story. And not only that, but it looks like you and your lawyers deliberately tried to hide evidence from this court." That's a nightmare scenario for anyone in a legal battle. But that's exactly what just happened to President Trump. A federal judge just exposed multiple contradictions in Trump's sworn testimony, called out his legal team for bad faith and deliberate concealment, and stripped away the legal defenses his side had been relying on. This is devastating for Trump. This is the kind of thing that can destroy your credibility in court and lead to serious legal consequences. And it's all happening right now in multiple cases at the same time. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
The former president's claim that this is protected by executive privilege just does not stand. In this case, we're talking about Mark Meadows, who is, of course, former chief of staff. He's a very, very important witness. He was there through all of this, and in some cases played a key role trying to pressure people to try to help support the former president's false claims of vote fraud. You see there a list of some of the other aides: John Radcliffe, Robert O'Brien, Stephen Miller, Dan Scavino. All of these folks had, in some cases, gone in and refused to answer certain questions because the former president was making this claim of executive privilege. The judge, in this case, Beryl Howell, who was a former chief judge in the Washington, D.C. federal court, she has ruled that they must comply with the Justice Department's request to answer these questions. Now,
we're not talking about one judge in one case. We're talking about multiple federal judges across different proceedings who are all reaching the same conclusion: that Trump's statements don't match the evidence, that his legal arguments are meritless, that his team has been trying to mislead the court. A panel of 3 federal appeals judges just labeled Trump's legal arguments as meritless. They pointed to emails, memos, and financial records that Trump's legal team deliberately hidden from the court. They used phrases like bad faith and deliberate concealment in their ruling. Those are harsh words from federal judges. Those are the kind of words that signal a judge has lost patience with your legal tactics. And when judges start using that kind of language, you're in serious trouble, because it means they don't trust you anymore. They think you've been trying to deceive the court. And once you lose judicial trust, it's almost impossible to get it back. Then there's Judge Arthur Engoron in the New York fraud case. He's been presiding over Trump's financial fraud trial, and he just issued rulings that completely demolished Trump's defense. Trump's lawyers have been arguing that financial disclaimers on his statements insulated him from fraud charges, that anyone who relied on his financial statements should have done their own due diligence, that the disclaimers warned people not to take the numbers at face value, but Judge Engoron wasn't buying it. He refuted those attempts and stated in his rulings that Trump had submitted fraudulent valuations. He said there were numerous obvious errors in Trump's financial statements, errors that proved the case for liability. So the judge is essentially saying these weren't just mistakes or differences of opinion about property values. These were fraudulent statements with obvious errors that no reasonable person would make accidentally. That's a judge calling Trump a fraud. That's a judge saying the evidence proves Trump lied about his finances. And it gets worse. U.S. District Judge Sarah Ellis found that body cam footage and other evidence exposed several Trump administration officials who had lied about the use of force in something called Operation Midway Blitz. These officials were acting on direct White House orders, and the body cam footage showed they weren't telling the truth about what happened. The judge found their testimony was not credible, that the evidence contradicted what they said under oath, and this further undermines Trump's credibility in federal court because it shows a pattern. It shows that people working for Trump, following his orders, are willing to lie under oath, and when you see that pattern, judges start to wonder if the problem goes all the way to the top. Now I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, here we go again. Another story about Trump in the courts. Another judge supposedly exposing him. But nothing ever happens. He always gets away with it. And look, I understand that cynicism. We've seen Trump survive so many legal challenges that it sometimes feels like he's untouchable. But this is different. These aren't just accusations. These are federal judges in written rulings calling out specific contradictions between Trump's testimony and the evidence. These are judges using language like bad faith and deliberate concealment and fraudulent valuations. These are judges saying Trump and his team tried to mislead the court. That's serious. That has real legal consequences, and it's happening in multiple cases simultaneously. And on the other side, Trump supporters are probably thinking, this is just more lawfare, more politically motivated judges trying to take Trump down, more of the establishment weaponizing the courts against him. And yeah, there's definitely a political element to some of these cases. But here's the thing. When multiple judges looking at documentary evidence all independently reach the same conclusion that Trump's testimony doesn't match the facts, that's not politics. That's evidence. When judges point to specific emails and memos and financial records that contradict what Trump said under oath, that's not bias. That's just comparing testimony to documents and finding contradictions. The implications here are massive. If Trump lied under oath, that's perjury. If his lawyers deliberately conceal evidence, that's misconduct that could get them sanctioned or disbarred. If financial statements were fraudulently inflated, that's fraud with potential criminal implications. And if administration officials lied about the use of force while carrying out Trump's orders, that raises questions about what Trump knew and when he knew it. We're not talking about minor discrepancies here. We're talking about judges finding that Trump and people working for him made statements under oath that the documentary evidence proves were false. That's about as serious as it gets in the legal system. So stick with me, because we need to break down exactly what these judges found, what evidence exposed the contradictions, and what this means for Trump's mounting legal troubles. This could be a turning point. Okay, let's get into the details of what these judges actually found, because the specifics matter here. We need to understand exactly what contradictions were exposed and what evidence the judges relied on. So let's start with the Federal Appeals Court ruling, because that one is particularly damning. A panel of 3 federal appeals judges reviewed Trump's legal arguments in one of his ongoing cases, and they didn't just reject those arguments, they called them meritless. Now, meritless is a strong word in legal terminology. It doesn't just mean the argument lost. It means the argument had no legitimate legal basis. It means the lawyers who made the argument should have known better. It's a judge essentially saying this was a waste of the court's time, but the appeals panel didn't stop there. They went further and pointed to specific evidence that Trump's legal team had deliberately hidden from the court. Emails between Trump and his advisors, memos about financial decisions, records that directly contradicted the story Trump's lawyers were telling, and the judges used phrases like bad faith and deliberate concealment. Those are fighting words in the legal profession. Bad faith means you weren't just wrong, you were intentionally deceptive. Deliberate concealment means you knew evidence existed that would hurt your case and you tried to hide it from the court. When judges use that language, they're not just ruling against you, they're questioning your integrity as a lawyer and as a party to the litigation. So what evidence did Trump's team try to hide? We don't have all the details yet because some of it is still sealed or being reviewed, but from what's been reported, we're talking about emails that showed Trump was aware his financial statements contained inflated valuations, memos that discussed strategies for presenting properties as more valuable than they actually were, communications between Trump and his accountants where concerns were raised about the accuracy of financial disclosures. This is the kind of evidence that destroys the defense. Because if Trump's argument was, I didn't know there were problems with the valuations, I just signed what my accountants prepared, but then emails surfaced showing he was actively involved in inflating numbers, that argument falls apart. And if his lawyers knew this evidence existed and tried to keep it from the court, that's serious misconduct that could result in sanctions. The appeals court is clearly signaling that they think Trump's legal team crossed ethical lines in how they handled this case. Now let's talk about Judge Engoron's findings in the New York fraud case, because those are equally devastating. This case involves Trump's financial statements that he used to get loans and insurance and business deals. The allegation is that he systematically inflated the value of his properties to make himself look wealthier than he actually was, to get better loan terms, to pay lower insurance premiums, to make deals he otherwise couldn't have made. Trump's defense has been multi-pronged. He's argued that property valuations are subjective, and his were within the range of reasonable estimates. He's argued that the financial statements had disclaimers telling people to do their own due diligence. He's argued that nobody was actually harmed because all the loans were paid back. And he's argued that this is all politically motivated because the New York Attorney General is a Democrat who campaigned on investigating him. Judge Engoron has been hearing testimony and reviewing evidence for months, and his recent rulings just demolished these defenses one by one. On the disclaimers, Judge Engoron said they don't protect you from fraud. You can't just slap a disclaimer on fraudulent statements and claim that absolves you of liability. The law doesn't work that way. If you make materially false statements, a disclaimer doesn't give you a free pass. And Judge Engoron found that Trump's statements contain fraudulent valuations, not just aggressive valuations or optimistic estimates, but fraudulent valuations, values that were so far from reality that they couldn't be explained as honest differences of opinion. And he pointed to numerous obvious errors that proved this wasn't just disagreement about methodology, these were deliberate inflations of value. For example, Trump claimed his triplex apartment in Trump Tower was 3 times bigger than it actually was. That's not a subjective valuation difference, that's just a false statement of square footage. He valued Mar-a-Lago as if it could be sold as a private residence when deed restrictions prevented that. That's not a valuation methodology dispute, that's ignoring legal restrictions that affect value. These are the kinds of obvious errors Judge Engoron is talking about, things that show this wasn't just aggressive accounting, this was fraud. And here's what makes this so significant. Judge Engoron's findings aren't just opinions. They're based on documentary evidence, emails between Trump and his accountants, spreadsheets showing the calculations, property records that prove the actual square footage or restrictions, financial documents that show the real market values. So when Trump testifies that he believed the valuations were accurate, the judge can point to documents that show Trump knew they weren't. When Trump says he relied on experts, the judge can point to emails where those experts raised concerns and Trump overruled them. When Trump claims the numbers were reasonable, the judge can point to comparable properties that sold for a fraction of what Trump claimed his were worth. This is why credibility matters in court. Once a judge finds you've made false statements under oath, they stop believing anything you say without corroborating evidence. Then there's the Operation Midway Blitz situation, which adds another layer to this pattern of false testimony. Operation Midway Blitz was a Trump administration operation involving National Guard deployment. Administration officials testified about what happened during this operation. They made statements under oath about the use of force, about what orders were given, about how the operation was conducted. But then Judge Sarah Ellis reviewed body cam footage and other evidence, and she found that what the officials said under oath didn't match what the video showed. The body cam footage contradicted their testimony. Other documentary evidence showed they weren't telling the truth about key details, and Judge Ellis didn't mince words. She said their testimony was not credible. She found they had lied about the use of force, and she noted these officials were acting on direct White House orders, so this wasn't just rogue agents doing their own thing. These were people carrying out Trump's orders who then lied about it under oath. Why would they lie? Well, probably because the truth would make Trump look bad. Probably because the body cam footage showed uses of force that weren't justified. Probably because admitting what really happened would expose the administration to legal liability. So they came up with this story. They coordinated their testimony, and they hoped nobody would check it against the physical evidence. But Judge Ellis did check. She reviewed the body cam footage frame by frame. She compared it to their testimony, and she found the contradictions. And now those officials have lost all credibility in court. And Trump, by extension, has another legal problem. Because if people carrying out his orders are willing to lie under oath, that suggests a culture of dishonesty that goes all the way to the top. Let's connect these dots, because the pattern is important. We have federal judges in multiple cases finding that Trump, or people working for him, made false statements under oath. We have judges pointing to documentary evidence, emails, memos, body cam footage, financial records that prove the testimony was false. We have judges using language like bad faith, deliberate concealment, fraudulent valuations, not credible. These aren't isolated incidents, this is a pattern, and patterns matter in law. When you see someone repeatedly making false statements under oath across multiple cases, that goes to their character and credibility. It means judges in future cases will be skeptical of anything they say. It means juries will be told about this history of dishonesty. It means the presumption of truthfulness that most witnesses start with doesn't apply anymore. And here's what makes this even worse for Trump. Some of these cases are civil and some are criminal. The New York fraud case is civil, meaning the penalties are financial. But perjury, lying under oath, that's a crime. If prosecutors decide to charge Trump with perjury based on these contradictions that judges have exposed, that's a whole different ballgame. That's potential prison time, not just fines or business restrictions, actual criminal liability. Now, will prosecutors actually bring perjury charges? That's a complicated question. Perjury is notoriously hard to prove. You have to show the person knowingly made a false statement about a material fact. You have to prove they knew it was false at the time. You have to show it mattered to the case. And you have to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a high bar. But when you have judges already finding in written rulings that testimony was contradicted by documentary evidence, when you have emails and videos that prove statements were false, that makes the prosecution's job a lot easier. The political implications of all this are also significant. Trump is serving his second term. He's facing multiple legal challenges. And now we have judges publicly calling out contradictions in his testimony. That's ammunition for his opponents. That's evidence they can point to when they say Trump is dishonest, when they say he's not fit for office, when they say he's a criminal. Trump supporters will dismiss all of this as political persecution. They'll say the judges are biased. They'll say this is lawfare designed to take Trump down. And some of them will have a point about political motivations behind some of these cases. But at some point, when judge after judge, looking at hard evidence, reaches the same conclusion that Trump's statements don't match the facts, it becomes harder to explain away. It becomes harder to say everyone's biased and Trump's telling the truth. Because if that were true, at least some judges would be ruling in his favor on these credibility issues. But they're not. They're consistently finding that Trump's testimony is contradicted by the evidence. And let's talk about the legal consequences beyond potential criminal charges. In the civil cases, losing credibility with the judge is devastating. Judges decide these cases, and if the judge doesn't believe your testimony, if they've already found you lied about one thing, they're not going to believe you about anything else without corroborating evidence. So even if Trump's defense on some issues might have merit, even if some of his arguments might be legally sound, the judge isn't going to accept them if they rely on Trump's word. They're going to require documentary proof. They're going to require independent corroboration, and that makes it much harder to defend yourself. You can't just take the stand and tell your side of the story. You need documents and witnesses and physical evidence to back up every claim, and if those don't exist, you lose. All right, let's break this down into the core points you need to understand about these judicial findings and what they mean for Trump. Point number 1, the scope and significance of judicial findings against Trump's credibility. We're not talking about one judge in one case expressing skepticism. We're talking about multiple federal judges across different cases, independently finding that Trump's testimony was contradicted by evidence. A 3-judge federal appeals panel calling his legal arguments meritless and accusing his lawyers of bad faith and deliberate concealment. Judge Engoron in New York finding fraudulent valuations and obvious errors in Trump's financial statements. Judge Ellis finding that administration officials lied under oath about Operation Midway Blitz while carrying out White House orders. Each of these individually would be damaging. Together, they create a pattern that's devastating for Trump's credibility in any future legal proceedings. Because judges talk to each other, they read each other's rulings, and when they see a pattern of dishonesty, they take that into account. Point number 2, the documentary evidence that exposed the contradictions. What makes these findings so powerful is that they're not based on he said, she said disputes. They're based on hard evidence that directly contradicts Trump's testimony. Emails that show Trump knew about valuation problems. Memos that discuss inflating property values. Body cam footage that proves testimony about use of force was false. Financial records that show properties weren't worth what Trump claimed. Square footage data that proves Trump's apartment wasn't the size he said it was. This is the kind of evidence that's impossible to argue with. You can't spin an email where you discuss inflating values. You can't explain away body cam footage that shows something different than what you testified to. You can't argue about square footage when the building plans prove the actual size. This documentary evidence is what makes these judicial findings so solid and so damaging. Point number 3, the legal consequences Trump now faces. In the civil cases, Trump has essentially lost his credibility with the judges. That means his testimony alone isn't enough to prove his defenses. He needs independent corroboration for everything. And in some cases, the judges have already ruled against him on key issues based on the contradictions they found. Judge Engoron has already found liability in the fraud case. The question now is just about the amount of penalties, and those could be massive. We're talking potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in fines, possibly restrictions on Trump's ability to do business in New York, maybe even forcing him to give up control of some properties or business operations. In the criminal context, there's potential exposure to perjury charges. If prosecutors decide to pursue charges based on false testimony, that's serious criminal liability. Perjury carries potential prison time. And while it's a hard charge to prove, having judges already finding in written rulings that testimony was contradicted by evidence makes that path much easier. Point number 4. Why the pattern matters more than individual incidents. One instance of contradicted testimony might be explained away as a mistake or a misunderstanding. But when you see the same pattern across multiple cases, multiple judges, multiple types of evidence, that's different. That shows this isn't just an error, this is a pattern of behavior. And patterns are what convince judges and juries. They show character, they show intent, they show this isn't just one bad day or one misstatement, this is how someone operates. And once that pattern is established, it affects everything. Future testimony is viewed skeptically. Future legal arguments are scrutinized more carefully. Future claims require more proof. The pattern becomes a lens through which everything Trump says or does legally is evaluated, and that's a huge handicap in any legal proceeding. Point number 5. The political and public perception implications. We're in Trump's second term. These judicial findings are becoming part of the public record. Trump's opponents will use them in campaigns. They'll point to judges saying Trump made fraudulent statements. They'll quote the language about bad faith and deliberate concealment. They'll show body cam footage that contradicts testimony from Trump officials. And while Trump's core supporters will dismiss all of this as biased judges and political persecution, independent voters might see it differently. They might wonder why so many judges are reaching the same conclusions. They might look at the documentary evidence and question Trump's honesty, and that could affect his political standing even though he can't run again, because it affects his ability to campaign for other Republicans. It affects his influence within the party. It affects how history will judge his presidency. So where does this all go from here? What happens next? In the short term, Trump's legal teams will appeal every adverse ruling. They'll argue the judges were wrong. They'll claim bias. They'll try to get higher courts to overturn these findings. And some appeals might succeed on technical grounds. But the underlying credibility findings are hard to overturn. When a trial judge who heard testimony and reviewed evidence says a witness wasn't credible, appeals courts usually defer to that. They weren't in the courtroom. They didn't see the witness testify. So they typically accept the trial judge's credibility determinations, which means these findings are likely to stick. In the civil fraud case, we're moving toward a final judgment on penalties. Judge Engoron has already found liability. Now he's determining how much Trump has to pay and what other restrictions to impose. And given that he found fraudulent valuations and obvious errors, the penalties are likely to be severe. This isn't going to be a slap on the wrist. This is going to be a judgment that seriously impacts Trump's finances and business operations. On the perjury front, prosecutors have decisions to make. Do they charge Trump with lying under oath? Do they go after the administration officials who lied about Operation Midway Blitz? Do they treat the contradictions in testimony as sufficient evidence to bring criminal charges? These are tough calls because perjury prosecutions are politically sensitive and legally difficult. But the fact that judges have already found the testimony was contradicted by evidence gives prosecutors a strong foundation if they decide to move forward. And with Trump in his second term, unable to run again, some of the political calculations that might have deterred prosecution before don't apply anymore. Prosecutors might feel they have more freedom to pursue charges without it being seen as trying to influence an election. The other question is how Trump himself responds. Does he acknowledge any of this? Does he adjust his legal strategy? Does he settle cases to avoid further exposure? Or does he double down and keep fighting every case to the bitter end? Based on his history, he'll probably keep fighting. He doesn't back down. He doesn't admit fault. He doesn't settle if he can avoid it, which means we're going to see these legal battles continue to play out publicly. More hearings, more rulings, more judges finding contradictions, more documentary evidence being revealed, and all of that continues to damage his credibility and his legal position. Here's my prediction of how this plays out. The civil fraud judgment is going to be massive. Trump will appeal, but the core findings will stand. He'll end up paying significant penalties and facing business restrictions. The perjury question will remain open for a while. Prosecutors will investigate, but might ultimately decide not to charge because of the difficulty of proving perjury beyond reasonable doubt. But the threat will hang over Trump and everyone in his orbit. The pattern of judicial findings that his testimony was contradicted by evidence will become established fact. Future cases will reference these rulings. Future judges will view Trump's credibility skeptically, and that will make every subsequent legal battle harder for him to win. In the court of public opinion, Trump supporters won't care. They'll see this as more proof the system is rigged against him, but everyone else will see a pattern of dishonesty that's been documented by multiple judges looking at hard evidence, and that will cement Trump's legacy as someone who was repeatedly found to have lied under oath. The bottom line, Trump got caught. Multiple judges examined his testimony, compared it to documentary evidence, and found contradictions. They called him out in written rulings using harsh language about bad faith and fraud and false statements. And those findings have serious legal and political consequences that Trump can't escape. He can spin it politically. He can claim bias. He can appeal. But the documentary evidence exists. The judicial findings are in the record, and they're not going away. This is the reality Trump now faces, a legal record showing a pattern of dishonesty that will follow him through every remaining case and into history. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over.